The Seeking Eye Life Exploration podcast is and will always be free to access. But if you would like to support my work, please consider joining my Patreon or signing up on YouTube as a channel member. By doing so, you will receive exclusive benefits, including early access to future podcast episodes, access to hosted discussion groups, and access to non-podcast supplementary videos. So click the join button underneath this video to join as a YouTube channel member, or find the link to my Patreon page in the description. Thank you.
My name is Kristofer Key. I'm an American citizen. I live in the state of Georgia. My background is I've got a specialist degree. For those people who don't know, that's a degree between master's level and doctorate. It's kind of an in-between. I'm looking to get my doctorate down the road, but that'll be a down the road thing. I got other more pressing issues. The degrees I have, my bachelor's is in history. I also have my educational certificate. My master's is in science education, and my specialist is in specializing in education. So I've got history and science under my belt. I'm not claiming grand expertise, but I do have it. I'm also retired from the United States military. As I like to tell people, I consider myself an informed layman when it comes to NDE research. I don't present myself as an expert. I feel experts are people at the doctorate level, mainly, who directly interact with the near-death experiencer population and stuff like that. To me, that's expertise. Those are the people that tend to be with INDS or the perceptual divisions of the University of Virginia. Those are experts, in my opinion. You can also be an expert if you've done research and published, stuff like that. Those are the experts in my book. I'm not claiming to be them. And I really dislike when people who are not experts present themselves as an expert.
Fair enough. So what got you interested, first of all, in the subject of near-death experiences? As a historian and a science, you would have thought that it would be a very unusual thing to get involved in.
What happened was, in 2001, I had heard about NDEs, but I kind of just dismissed the idea as, a brain hallucination. Then came out that Lancet study, and it took the opposite stance. That just caught my attention. Not what I expected, okay. Maybe, it just got me more curious. And from there, I just started studying the subject more. It's curiosity.
Sure. So when you say you've got your degree in history, I think the main one that would interest people in this field is the science degree. So what is involved with that science degree? Because that's in between, you say, master's and PhD.
My master's level was a science degree in education. What happened was, to get that, I had to study a lot of the various different subjects that a public school teacher would teach at both the high school and the middle school level. I had to study the subjects, demonstrate the knowledge of the subjects. So again, it's a science degree that is focused on education. I'm not going to present it as truly being a research level scientific degree. But again, it makes me a knowledgeable layman. I know what the science says in the subjects. I know how to evaluate science, stuff like that.
Sure. So when the Lancet study came out, which was Dr. Pim van Lommel, and you saw that, what was your immediate thoughts on that, having held the view that it's all kind of brain stuff before that?
Well, my immediate thought was, that's neat. Okay, maybe I'm possibly wrong. This might be worth digging into. Like I said, I also had a degree in history. So obviously near-death experiences, it even seemed pretty obvious to me then, might influence religion and stuff like that. And I do find comparative religion to be fascinating. So it was just okay, now I'm curious. So I just started studying the stuff, tried to read both sides. I read von Lommel, let me see, um, Melvin Morris, Michael Sabom, who else? I did read Blackmore. I read a bit of Gary Worley's stuff, for the skeptical side.
Gerald Worley.
I dabbled with Keith Augustine. I'll come back to that point later. I tried, and of course, I read Grayson and all that too. Later on, I also read Satori, stuff like that. I tried to read both sides. I read the stuff from Ines, but like I said, I tried to read the skeptical stuff too. I'm going to start off with discussing this for people. What is a near-death experience? If you're someone that was to sit down and ask me, I would first often say it's an exceptional state of consciousness. It's not the norm. The next things I would tell people is that the name is a bit of a misnomer. We call it a near-death experience, but oftentimes it is a death experience. People who are, for all purposes, dead have the experience. So if people are saying, protesting, well, they're not really dead, stuff like that, it's called a near-death experience, I simply point out to them the word malaria means bad air in Latin, but nobody thinks malaria is caused by bad air nowadays. There's sometimes the name of what's going on might be different than what it actually is. The name stuck, so I'm going to keep using it. So, and the next thing people like to quibble is, well, it can't be a death experience, but there's a hidden premise in that comment. One, the hidden premise is death cannot be reversed. That's a hidden premise. And number two, and this is more important, the next thing is death equals consciousness extinction. That's the second hidden premise. Now, those have not been demonstrated. So until then, it can be classified as a death experience, especially when you're talking about cardiac arrest patients, and then it's what they experience while dead, and let's go on to that. So I'm going to discuss the NDE, and there's stages to it. And this is not all NDEs, but there are ones that happen like this with all these key stages. I'm just going to discuss it first. Have to swig some water. So the very first thing is a person comes near death or dead. So then consciousness leaves the body, and then it appears at a separate location from the physical body, oftentimes above it, sometimes to the side of it, but interestingly enough, to the best of my knowledge, never underneath it. That conscious looks down and sees the physical body, and sometimes they're puzzled by it. Sometimes they realize, oh, that's my physical body. I'm dead, but I'm not dead. They can perceive their environment. Sometimes they report trying to interact with people, but, not successfully. And this is another key point. They have a normal sensory level, even if their body has limited senses due to disability. For example, a person who has to wear glasses will report in this stage that they had normal vision. Somebody with bad hearing, their hearing's normal. So that's what I would call the first stage, the beginning of the NDE. So, and I'm going to make a point to note this later. This is where we get your vertical NDE cases. I'll go over that. The next stage that'll come around is the transitionary stage. This consciousness perceives something to indicate a journey is going to take place. Something maybe akin to a tunnel, oftentimes in the West, but you can get other things such as a path. Some cultures have a canoe, but it's or a door, but it's anything that would take you from one place to another. But as been noted by others, though, we never have a path that continues downward, so to speak, which is interesting when you notice, at least in older oftentimes, the underworld was considered to be an NDE. I mean, the underworld was considered to be the location of the afterlife, excuse me. So that's the transition. The consciousness goes through it. Now we're in the spiritual realm. You can call it that for, heaven, call it what you wish. Now they arrive in a realm that is, and I'm going to explain more about this later, that is more real than real. That's how they would explain it. And that's a hard one for people to understand. The only way I can explain it is, dream comparisons. For example, when you're there's levels of dreams. We have normal dreams, vivid dreams, and vivid dreams. A vivid dream, by the nature of it, feels more real than a regular dream. However, both dreams and vivid dreams feel real in the moment. But when the dream is done, we know they're not of the same level of reality as waking consciousness. I'm not going to say they were unreal, because clearly the dream happened. It was real, but it doesn't have that real feeling to it of normal waking consciousness. So when NDEers say that, they often compare our conscious level on Earth to a dream, that their new level is more real than that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think conceptually, I think the problem is again, with these sort of things, without the experience of that more real than real, it's impossible for us who perceive waking reality as real. It's impossible to kind of perceive what that must be like experientially. But conceptually, as an analogy, that makes total sense.
Yeah, that's the only way I can explain it. The next thing is they report they have superior senses to what they had on Earth. They perceive new colors they have never seen before. They hear new sounds. They are oftentimes greeted by deceased loved ones who appear to be in the prime of their life, not as they were before death. Communication is via thought, telepathy, call it what you wish. That is the spiritual realm. Oftentimes in this realm, they report, things like time has no meaning or it's timeless. Okay, it's a return to home. I feel like this is my true home. I'm back. So that is the spiritual realm aspect to it. So heading on from there, and I'm going to go over these points more again later. The next stage, and not all NDEs have this, but many do. Well, enough do, I should say. It's what's called the life review. This consciousness reviews its life in order to understand how they treated others while on Earth. This review is sometimes done in parallel with something they call a being of light and higher order beings, stuff like that. And what they're doing is they're looking at their life from the aspect of how loving they were to others, how kind they were to others, stuff like that. Material wealth, social status doesn't have a lot of meaning to it. For example, in I think Bruce Grayson's latest book, I wish I could remember the title of it. I just went brain blank, but I know the case. After by Bruce Grayson, he mentions the account of a man who was involved in organized crime. And while during his life review, he felt the pain he put others in, from their perspective. And that's another key thing. Oftentimes during the review, you'll see it from the perspective of the other person, the person you interacted with. So that's one example from Grayson. In Howard Storm's account, he talked about how he could feel the disappointment and anger that sometimes his dad had with him because, Storm just was being a bit on the self-centered side, and he didn't understand his dad's frustrations. Another case I read had, as a kid, a man had killed a bird. Something sometimes kids do. Later on during his NDE, he felt the chicks of the bird starved to death. Turns out he had killed their mother. He felt it from the chick's perspective. And then there was a case in Thomas Sawyer's, I think his name was Thomas Sawyer's, where he was really just as a teenager, he had a man cut him off in traffic, like I think it was walked in front of him or something. So Storm got really mad and punched him repeatedly in the face. During his life review, he felt, the blows, and he felt it from the perspective of the person being hit. And later on, he said he came to understand that the person was not functioning very well because he was distraught. So that's an example of how life reviews work. So after the life review, obviously this is a near-death experience, so the person has to return. So we have the return from the spirit realm. The consciousness is told they need to return. Sometimes it might be, in like Eastern NDEs, you being here is basically a clerical error. In Western NDEs, it's more a case of your tasks on Earth are not yet done. Your family needs you. And oftentimes the conscious will plead and argue, please let me stay behind. That was a feature, for example, of Howard Storm's case. So, however, it's told it has to return to its body, so it returns. Then, it comes in some cases, they're going back to their body, they're looking down on it, I don't want to get back in that, stuff like that. So, but they do, and that's the return from the end of the NDE. So that would be, again, a brief synopsis of what a full NDE experience would be. So my next thing is, as I tell people, NDEs, the experience is modified by somebody's culture. It has a concept, your culture is how you conceptualize things. That's true for everybody. So it would be impossible for NDEs not to be conceptualized by a culture. It just wouldn't have any meaning if you didn't do that. So there is a cultural aspect to NDEs. For example, in Western NDEs, people typically tend to see Jesus. In Eastern NDEs, they might see more appropriate figures. So that's a cultural aspect.
And you also mentioned as well about the tunnel is different between cultures as well. So, for example, in Japan, they'll see a ferry having to cross on a boat, or as you say, a canoe or something, as opposed to a tunnel.
Yeah, and as it wouldn't make sense to anybody if you didn't do it that way. So, but there's also aspects that can go against somebody's cultural viewpoint. For example, atheist NDEs. Most atheists reject the notion of an afterlife. They have no expectation of it. So, them even having the NDE goes against their cultural framework. Or, sometimes non-Christians report encountering Jesus. Again, that goes against their cultural framework. Also, things like telepathy. That goes against every cultural framework because there's no culture on the planet that speaks in telepathy. But another type would be, say, Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't believe in an immediate afterlife. They believe in spirit sleep. So according to them, when you die, you go to sleep. So them having an NDE would be against their cultural framework, and seeing their deceased relatives would be against it. Or, another type would be religious fundamentalist, experience a loving, caring God and not a judgmental one. So these all go against the culture, manifested within their culture to an extent. It came at them in ways they can understand, but at the same time, it went against the culture too. Does that make sense?
It does, and there are cases that you're aware of where this happens, like Jehovah's Witnesses meeting deceased loved ones, etc.
I've just used that as a hypothetical example. I think I've
Right,
seen
I
one,
see.
but yeah, I'm going to use that as a
Just to illustrate
hypothetical to illustrate the point. But certainly there are atheist NDEs. No one debates that one, and they have no cultural belief in an afterlife, and they still experience. And we certainly have non-Christian NDEs where they experience Jesus, and that's not in their notion of it. And telepathy is not within their notion. So I would have, I just use Jehovah's Witnesses as an hypothetical, but even if there was no Jehovah Witness NDE on the planet, my point would still stand with the atheist NDEs, and there's certainly fundamentalist NDEs out there that are that way.
Sure. Well, could one not argue that even if they experience something that's beyond or outside of their culture, the fact that they live in a culture where these things are known could have maybe a third party kind of influence on it, if you know what I mean?
I've thought about that. I mean, it's a logical possibility, but that's why I included something like telepathy. That's not anybody's culture thing. Or timelessness would be another thing. That's not part of anybody's culture. I mean, there is no cultural belief from anybody in seriously speaking in telepathy. We just don't. You know, fundamentalist NDEs, they tend to really believe what they believe about God. I mean, they would tend to laugh and dismiss notions of a genuinely loving God. So again,
You'd have thought
this,
that they'd experience what they would expect given the strength of that belief.
yes. So to wrap up this part, I'm going to discuss the Howard Storm NDE. To understand Howard Storm, he had his NDE when he was a university professor. I don't remember exactly how old he was, but he was an art professor. He talked about how he had been raised as a bit of a fundamentalist, but at the time of his NDE, he was an atheist. So this is going to go all into his NDE. So as Howard Storm is dying, his consciousness separates from his body. He looks down and sees his corpse and he recognizes, that's me. And he wakes up in the hospital setting that he was in. He starts walking around some and he hears basically people saying, Howard, come with me. And he looks around and he hears the voices and he sees basically like a dark hall. And he starts going with them, talking with them. And in this case, this is one of the more rare hellish NDEs. These beings are completely malign. So that he keeps going with them. He's like, when are we going to get there? They're like, shut up, stuff like that. Come on, get with it. They're making fun of him. And eventually he reaches a point where he's not going to go any farther with them. And then, they start attacking him. He says, beating him, tearing him to pieces. And he hears a distant voice in his head saying, pray to God. And then he kind of starts arguing himself like, I don't do that. And it says loudly, pray to God again. So then he prays to God and he is rescued, taken up into the proper afterlife realm. And I'm not going to go into all the details of the case, but a key aspect of this case to me is he asked the question, what is the one true religion? And he said he had kind of expected to get an answer, say something like the Catholics or something like that. And the answer he gets is what brings you closer to God. Now, the reason I use this case is it has the, like I say, the stage of the transition, and it has the basically two spirit realms in it. But what makes this case interesting to me is, like I say, Howard Storm had a fundamentalist background and an atheist background. So in his atheist background, you would not anticipate an afterlife period. Now, in his fundamentalist background, you would. But this is where things get nuanced with this case. The attackers, he said his entire perception of them was that the attackers had once been human beings stripped of all goodness, not genuine demons. Now, in fundamentalist Christianity, it's taught that upon one's death, you know, basically the soul goes to heaven or hell. So according to fundamentalism, those attackers should not have been out of hell. So if he was to hallucinate the experience based on his fundamentalism, they would have been demons. See the nuance? That's a nuance. And as someone who grew up in fundamentalism a bit myself, we know that nuance. And the second one is question, what is the one true religion? And then he asked also, I should say, he also asked the question, what about errors in the Bible's contradictions, stuff like that? And his first answer was, a fundamentalist would say, what is the true religion? They would surely expect to get the answer of so-and-so sect. You know what I'm saying? Not the religion that brings you closer to God, because fundamentalists tend to see any religious movement outside of their own as a satanic deception, or at least a great error. And the next question was, he asked, what about errors and stuff like that in the Bible? And the next thing was, what about them? Not that they don't exist, but they said it's the way you're reading the book. You're looking for the mistakes, for the problems. You're not reading it properly. You're not reading it as a guide. Again, if you were to give that answer in a fundamentalist church, you'd probably be run on out. Because as far as they're concerned, there is no errors or contradictions. Not that you ought to read it in a spiritual sense and get the good points. But can you see how this NDE completely went against the grain of what this man's worldview, both of fundamentalism and atheism?
Yeah. So what he experienced kind of wasn't within the tenets of fundamental Christianity or fundamental religion or atheism as we commonly know it to be, as he was.
So, and that's why I use that NDE. It shows how the experience itself can go against a culture or against somebody's perceptions of what it should be. So that brings us the explanations of how do we explain this. And people who support survival-based models simply say, it's true. Consciousness leaves the body. That explains why they see their hospital setting wherever they're at. It does go down to let me back up. It's an external realm. Consciousness leaves the body. Then they go to that external realm. Then they have their life review. Then they return. It's an external experience. That is how people. That's how people who have the NDE explain it. That's how people who support survival-based models explain it. Now, obviously, not everybody supports that explanation. Yeah, there's some disagreements over this one. So, but that's the explanation given by the experiencers, and that's the explanation given by people who have tended to seriously research the subject. That is an external experience. Now, I'm going to start with this. Skeptics. I do not call them skeptics because they're not skeptical about anything related to this. And I don't mean that as an insult. I call them materialists because that's what they are. Again, it's not meant to be a slight, but what are they skeptical about? They maintain it's an internal event. Nothing leaves the body. It's a fantasy created by a dying brain, drawing off previous life, time of experience, and culture. When asked about, the similarities in NDEs that people like Shushan have discovered, that how I could break it down into stages and all that. And they would say that would be caused by a brain structure, stuff like that. And then they say,
the fact that people experience a similar chronology and similar experiences is due to the fact that our brains are effectively identical in structure, etc., as human beings.
Yeah, that's how they would explain it. And then they would argue that an embellishment happens afterwards. Now, I'm going to take a detour from this point before I go back to it. I used to like to argue and debate online. I don't do that much nowadays. I consider it more of a waste of time than anything else because, I've decided it's more and more I just want to live my life, come to my viewpoints, stuff like that. Like I said, I got my first degree in history. And I remember I started coming across the NDE skeptics, but I also came across the Jesus never existed types. And, as a historian, telling me something, like Jesus never existed, get real. And then I started looking at the stuff, and I noticed certain patterns. And then more and more as I started looking at the Jesus mytherism, I noticed it was so similar to how many time materialists approach NDE research. For example, Jesus mythers tend to be very ideological. They clearly do not like religion, do not like Christianity. They really dislike it. The same thing could be said about the materialist. And the next thing I noticed is Jesus mythers denigrate genuine experts in history. For example, Bart Ehrman. They say we can't use him despite his excellent degrees to evaluate the existence of Jesus because he had once been a Christian. They would say the same thing about Maurice Casey, stuff like that. Anybody who was a genuine expert in this, they would just say, he's been corrupted by Christianity. It's like, give me a break.
Despite the many, many decades and lifetime of research into that specific area.
Yeah. The materialists do the same thing with NDE researchers. For example, they just say they're wooers and stuff like that. Again, and I like to point out, Bruce Grayson and others often started off as materialists. The closest they would really have to their accusation is Michael Sabom. But if you read his stuff closely, while he was a Christian when he wrote his book, he thought NDEs were trash, and he is more of a cultural Christian. He participated in it more because he thought it was a good thing and all that, but I would not argue he had a strong belief. Now, after his research, that changed. But see what I'm saying? The denigration of the experts. Then, the next same pattern, the elevation of non-experts. For example, among the Jesus Never Existed Brigade, they will quote you into the end of time from people like Earl Doherty, a nobody from Canada who argued Jesus never existed. Next, Earl Doherty, David Fitzgerald, some guy in California who argued Jesus never existed. People like frickin' Gandry who try to prop up that Jesus was a copy of a pagan deity arguments. They denigrate the real experts, and they use these non-experts. Materialists do the same thing. For example, Gary Worley. Now, I'm going to grant he does have a legitimate medical degree in anesthesia, but he doesn't interact with the NDE population. He just reads what other people have read. Or Keith Augustine. He has a master's in philosophy. Again, nothing wrong with that. But those two are certainly not experts, and they should not be put anywhere near the same equivalent to people like Grayson, Sabam, the late Peter Fenwick, Penny Satori, and all of that stuff. They're just not on the same caliber of them. Again, it's the same pattern. So for me, arguing against Jesus mytherism was pretty easy. But when I really learned how to argue well against the mythers, it carried over to dealing with the materialist. And another example that I noticed between them was this. There tends to be a binary thinking. For example, among the Jesus Never Existed Brigade, they tend to think it's a choice between Jesus never existed or the Christian resurrecting from the dead Jesus. It's binary to them. They just struggle with considering the third notion of the man in the middle who was a bit embellished. For the materialist, to them it's, I gotta pick the near-death experience being a genuine experience or science and rationality. It's one or the other. And it's not so binary. So another thing I noticed about, and this is more with the materialist, they do not seriously interact with the NDE population or the researchers. For example, Gary Worley, Keith Augustine, when all their time writing about the Pam Reynolds case, never once talked to the woman when she was alive. Why not? If you want to know what really happened, or if you want to run by your views, she's the person to ask. Or another, certainly the NDE researchers such as Titus Rivas, Penn's Michael Sabom, Grayson, they all talk to her. That's what you should do.
Both her and her neurosurgeon as well on the case.
Yeah. There just seemed to be no interest in their part in talking to all them. And another time this came back, and I'm going to say at the time I wrote this off as dishonesty, but more as I look back on it, and I saved the email. What happened was this was in 2010 on Michael Prescott's forum. The Al Sullivan NDE case was brought up. Al Sullivan was having surgery, and I'm not going to go too much into this. And normal surgeries, eyes closed, stuff like that. He had a near-death experience. And as soon as he came back, he reported that he saw one of his doctors kind of flapping their arms around.
Yes. Is it Dr. Takata?
Yeah, Dr. Tanaka. So as soon as he had the experience, he told the cardiologist La Sala about it. I saw a dude flapping his arms around. That's weird. Makes sense? So I'm saying as soon as he came through and he told about it. Now what happened was this. During the interview process with Dr. Tandaka, he said, yeah, I normally flap my arms around, but I don't remember if I did it in this specific instance. Okay, that's fair enough. He was interviewed down the road. I'll give an example for myself. Like I'm a teacher now. Oftentimes when I'm teaching a class and stuff like that, sometimes I might just do an eye roll, something frustrating, goofy kid behavior. I normally do that. My students have noted that about me. But if I was to be asked, say, years down the road, if I did an eye roll and say so-and-so class and so-and-so day, odds are I wouldn't remember, right? Makes sense. Odds are I wouldn't remember. But I'd be like, yeah, it sounds like something I would do. So what happened was this. The case was brought up on the Michael Prescott forum. And then Keith Augustine copied and pasted this. And he said, psychologist David Lester basically stated this. The surgeon who flapped his arms did not recall whether or not he did so, and the other surgeon did not recall him doing so. Although he did confirm that the patient reported the experience immediately after the surgery. Now, to me, that seemed very suspicious. And my guess was that psychologist David Lester was trying to pull a fast one. Many people cannot recall exactly what they did at a given moment, like I've said. So here's what I did when I read that comment. I simply emailed Dr. Bruce Grayson about this case, just to clarify. And Dr. Grayson said, thank you for the email. I was actually the member of Cook's team who interviewed Al Sullivan, his cardiologist, and his cardiac surgeon. The surgeon was known for regularly flapping his arms, as far as I could ascertain. That is, surgical nurses and residents who had not worked with him were not aware of this idiosyncratic habit. However, he did acknowledge to me he typically did that in all of his surgeries when Al had his operation. So, although he couldn't swear he had done it, and we know he talked about it as soon as as soon as he came through. So, and this is what I basically told Bruce Grayson. Now, I still got all these emails. I made it a point to keep them. To make sure I'm reading your response correctly. While the doctor cannot swear that he had did the arm flapping during Mr. Sullivan's surgery, he did state he was in the habit of doing so, and that he knows he did it in the period when Mr. Sullivan had his surgery. And Dr. Bruce Grayson said, "Yes, you're reading my response correctly." So, the interesting point to me was this: one, far from being poorly corroborated, this case was excellently corroborated. But the next interesting thing that occurred to me was this: it took me about 5 minutes to email Dr. Bruce Grayson. That's it. Clarify. Did David Lester email Bruce Grayson? No evidence of it. Did Heath email David Lester? No evidence of it. You know what I'm saying? That's all it took. Now, at the time in 2010, I wrote it off as dishonesty. But now, more of a hindsight thing, I don't think they were being dishonest. I've just discovered people like them are so ideological about this, are so I know what's going on, stuff like that. I don't think it probably ever occurred to them to simply email Bruce Grayson. What's the point? I already know what's going on. But that's again a point. They were completely wrong about the case, and all that would have taken to correct it was a quick email. So now you have to have the goofy scenario of, we know Al Sullivan reported the experience, we know he reported immediately, and we know Dr. Takata was known for doing that flapping arm motion. So, what if he didn't do it that surgery? He just happened to hallucinate the one thing that Dr. Takata was known for on the one day Dr.
And
Takata didn't do it.
as I was, yeah, and I'd add as well, it's not something like, Dr. Takata, I think that was his name, lined up all of his instruments and pointed out which one was going to be used where, which you would expect to happen for anybody. It was flapping his arms. How many people, how many surgeons would do that? It's a very unusual thing to see and report.
The entire counter explanation is, okay, he happened to hallucinate the one thing Dr. Takata was known for on the one day Dr. Takata, who was known to do it, didn't do it. That's what the hallucination argument would have to be. Oh, give me a break. You know what I mean?
I would agree.
But I'm going to say, I'm going to credit those two now. Like I say, in 2010, I wrote it off as dishonesty and more experience. Ideological, like I discussed. But sometimes you do get dishonesty in this. For example, in Michael Shermer, when talking about the 2001 Lancet study, said this study is basically more evidence that NDEs have a physical cause. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. He didn't say it exact way, but the 2001 study said the exact opposite. You know what I mean? However, Michael Shermer does not comprehend what he reads, or Michael Shermer is lying. There is no two good explanations. Now, Michael Shermer is a pretty smart guy who knows how to read, so I'm going to go with lying, and he knows his audience will never verify it. All right, and that was one thing. And another parallel to Jesus mytherism, Jesus mythers almost never feel the need to make their own case of what really happened. You know what I'm saying? They just harp on the historicist case. Materialists never really feel much of a need to make their own case of what really happens during the near-death experience. You know what I'm saying? They just harp on the other guy's case. But sometimes you do get attempts, but you get multiple different arguments. For example, some Jesus mythers maintain Jesus is a copy of a pagan deity. Other Jesus mythers say he pre-existed in the celestial realms. And more, some Jesus mythers nowadays are saying that Jesus was made up by the Flavian family. And you see a similar thing to materialist, which are, some materialists will say, hypoxia or a lack of oxygen causes NDEs. Others will say that, it's caused by too much carbon or anesthesia. You know what I'm saying? They're dime a dozen for the explanations. No two materialists can agree what happens. Both sides agree the other side's full of it, but we can't tell you what happens. Next thing I came to realize is Jesus mythers like to say a lot of canards that are not really true. For example, Jesus mythers like to say, you can't use any secondary sources in history, stuff like that, or we can't use the ancient sources because they have traces of the supernatural in it, stuff like that. Or, we can't use Christian sources because they're written by Christians, the early Christian sources, and all of that's garbage. Of course you can use them. There's no such rules in history. It's just some goofy stuff mythers made up. Or, they say there's no primary source for Jesus. But then I'll point out to them that, so what? Most people mentioned in ancient sources don't have primary sources. For example, Boudica, or Boudicca, however the heck you pronounce it, she led a huge scale revolt. We don't have a direct primary source for her. Or, atheists, who led the one successful uprising against the Romans in history. Our sources from him are mainly Tacitus, and there might be one source more directly attached to him, but again, this is the guy who led the only successful revolt against the Romans in their history. And that's the sources we get for them. So to expect, the level of sources they demand for some ancient, peasant is absurd. And, those are their little canards they like to engage in. Something that's not even true. And, materialists engage in other type of similar canards. For example, they'll say, oh, we can't research NDEs, or they're not possibly because they're supernatural. But, the hidden premise is there that they suppose a worldview that would have NDEs being as supernatural. And for that worldview to work, is we have to know enough about nature to be able to say what is natural or what is not natural. And we don't have that level of knowledge. Or even then, that's the first little canard, So that's questionable right there. But okay, let's say if it is supernatural. Okay. Who says we can't know anything about the supernatural? It might not be amendable to the scientific method, but it doesn't mean that saying it's not amendable to the scientific method does not mean you can do nothing about it. I'm just saying for argument's sake. For argument's sake, even if it is supernatural, we can certainly know some stuff about it by using research methodologies. There's no logical reason you can't. So even if that first one was correct, so what? I don't even think it is, though. And the next thing they like to say is it's not scientific. But again, why not? Psychology is scientific, and you can certainly use psychological methods to study it. For example, quantitative and qualitative interviews. And it is testable. For example, there could be hidden numbers test. That would be one way to test the external argument. Materialists say that the commonality to NDEs is caused by brain structures. Find the brain structure, right? Those would be two immediate tests. And there's secondary type of tests you could do, such as vertical cases. And if an NDE is a hallucination, it should have a certain type of structure. Or if it's an external event, it should have certain type of certain patterns to it. So yeah, this is testable. I mean, the first two I mentioned, hidden numbers and brain region, would be the acid testing, and neither side has achieved that. But we can still look at the secondary aspects of it. So I disagree with them on that one.
Well, what do you think about the arguments that are put forth with the failure of finding the hidden numbers that have been done, etc., and the hidden images, and the fact that well, they will argue that is evidence then that it's nonsense.
I think they're going too far with that. One, I can see it. I can see why they think that way. But one, let's just say you're having a near-death experience. Of all the things going on, why are you going to go looking for the numbers or the symbols? You know what I'm saying? You're going to be much more fascinated by, hey, that's me down there.
And not even just going looking for the numbers, but going looking for the symbols that you don't know's there.
Yeah, I mean, one, you're not going to do that. And secondly, and this is, I want to note that does not erase the vertical cases we have. But more importantly, I came to realize something. Even if they came back with, what I'm saying, the numbers or the weird symbols, that would not change the mind of the materialist. They would just say it was some random lucky guess or fraud. It wouldn't have changed the variables for them. They still wouldn't accept it.
Especially given the very low figures that we would get for people that have these experiences.
Yeah, they still wouldn't accept it. So, I mean, I would love it, but at the same time, I don't think it's going to be the game changer that people make it out to be. So then moving on that one, the next one, extraordinary claims and evidence as made popular by the late Carl Sagan. It's one of the other things they like to use. The problem with this is this does not define the terms. What is an extraordinary claim? And what is extraordinary evidence? That's the first problem with that. Second problem with that is, there's no such thing as an extraordinary evidence. I mean, there's only regular evidence of a certain quality. So you can't make extraordinary evidence. If you can make the evidence, it's regular. And, there's times when this little claim wouldn't have worked. For example, with European explorers. This was used to be an old example put forth to David Hume. Sometimes European explorers found tribes that lived in areas where it never got cold enough for water to freeze. So to them, frozen water would be an extraordinary thing. And the only evidence the natives got was the European explorers telling them about it. That doesn't mean ice doesn't exist. This is a little silly scenario that I would give, but let's say somebody was truly abducted by aliens. They opened up a portal into his room. They went down there. Let's say not abducted, but they came into his house. They truly did this, opened up a portal. They were hanging out with him and all that, right? And he had a camera. But unfortunately for him, it was an old Kodak camera that only had like black and white film. And he took some pictures with them. And then the aliens left. And this all really happened. The only evidence he has is his crummy black and white photo, right? We both agree that's not extraordinary evidence, right? But the event happened. So that even to say so even if the evidence is not good enough, it doesn't mean the event's not true or the opposite. This means the evidence is not good enough. So that argument doesn't work. So then sometimes I like to say, well, we can't take testimonial evidence. That's hearsay, stuff like that. I'm like, dude.
Anecdotal evidence. Yeah.
Yeah. Dude, if we were to apply that rule uniformly, we couldn't have the entire profession of psychology. Because that's what they analyze. Or we couldn't do history or stuff like that. I mean, what would happen if we applied that rule all the time? So well, we can't take testimonial evidence. Okay, but if we apply that rule all the time, we have to throw out a lot of fields. I disagree with them because we certainly analyze it, like I've mentioned with qualitative and quantitative studies. Nobody tells the psychology profession you can't take testimonial evidence. Nobody tells that to historians. But here's the next kicker. If they truly apply that rule, they can't come to explanations for NDEs themselves. Hey, if we can't use testimonial evidence, you can't evaluate it either, right? So you can't go tell us this is what really happened. So we're stuck with testimonial evidence. So moving on. The next famous one is, God, we've heard this all the time. Correlation demonstrates causation. All right. That's just not true. It can be true, but it's not. For example, there are many correlations without causations. For example, an old joke one is decrease in piracy and the increase in global warming. As wooden ship pirates go down, the earth gets hotter and hotter. Therefore, the decrease in pirates is causing the earth to get warmer and warmer. Or, every time if you have cats and you got an empty box, you're going to have a cat in an empty box. Therefore, empty boxes cause cats. Not true. Or, we see this every day, increasing a car's speedometer is not there is a correlation between a car's speed and a car's speedometer, but the needle on the speedometer moving is not the cause of the car moving. So, all right. So those are all examples of the correlation did not show causation. So when they say the correlations of brain states to mental states demonstrates causation, they're going beyond the evidence. And the next thing they're doing is ignoring that other ontological models, such as dualism and idealism, can also explain the correlations. So they're acting like they're the only game in town. And also, they never ever really get down and try to tell you what amount of correlations would show materialism versus would show dualism. They never tell us what the correct amount is. How we can, saying they just don't. Now, for that, what they're doing is ignoring those other explanations. And, and they're also ignoring that they're not bad explanations. For example, one could lean toward a dualist ontological model for consciousness simply based on the fact that, brain split patients patients who've had their brain split in half still have a unified consciousness, not two consciousnesses. The placebo effect, where the mental state changes the outcome of the body based on belief. Or in the other cases, that people have had major loss of brain regions are still retaining the normal consciousnesses.
As well as the cases of severe hydrocephaly.
Yeah, stuff like that. So those are more, in my opinion, more aligned with dualism. So, these are a bunch of canards and none of them really work. So there used to be some older arguments for NDEs, stuff from the 80s. For example, hypoxia. As somebody's losing oxygen levels, they hallucinate. This is the NDE. But the problem with that is hypoxia hallucinations go from complex to simple, while the NDE goes from simple, complex, and if there's a return element, back to simple. It is not the same thing. And also, hypoxia hallucinations are highly frightening. And lastly, not everybody who has hypoxia has an NDE, or not every NDE is in a hypoxia patient. So obviously, hypoxia doesn't work.
There is a famous example, isn't there, of a comparison between NDEers' experiences and those the fighter pilots in centrifuges who experience similar, if not almost identical, experiences to near-death experiences. What do you think about that comparison as evidence for hypoxia?
I remember reading that study, and what happened was sometimes they had a disassociated state with it, but there wasn't reports. Now, unless you don't know something I don't of, seeing deceased loved ones going to another realm and stuff like that is more of a disembodiment. And again, unless every NDE is in a centrifugal, I don't think this is going to work. But okay, or Again, not everybody who has an NDE has, hypoxia. Then you got things like hypercarbia, or basically excess CO2. People oftentimes report during those hallucinations that they see like geometric shapes, musical notes, and numbers floating around, yet these are absent from NDEs. And, scuba divers, when they get too low, if they're not doing their gases correct and have excess CO2, they don't report NDEs. And oftentimes when people are going around, have excess CO2, they're flopping around, having seizures, stuff like that. None of that is consistent with NDEs or endorphins. Some people say it's caused by a flood of endorphins. That explains the good feelings, but endorphins build up, the pain goes away, then it gradually goes away. That's it. It doesn't necessarily cause hallucinations and all that. On the other hand, there's not a buildup, so to speak, with an NDE. It just goes. Then it ends. So it's not the same pattern.
So just bring it back to the oxygen and carbon explanations. Hasn't there also been studies done by Grayson and others that have tested the blood gas levels in near-death experience patients and found no unusual readings?
Yeah, that's been tested too. So yeah, these are dead arguments. Informed skeptics won't try it, in my experience. And then there's the cultural fantasy, and I've already explained why that doesn't work. So moving on. So one thing I've noticed in all this, I should mention something though, is when materialists try to make brain-based arguments for NDEs, we tend to give them a free pass. I'm not sure if that's wise, because the materialist explanation is that consciousness is an emergent product of the brain. Makes sense? So think about a balloon. Balloons can expand, right? If you put gases in a balloon, they expand. Therefore, an expanded balloon is the emerging thing of gas input to it. As you let the gas go, the balloon shrinks, right? Simple as that. So it should be a similar thing to the materialist model. If consciousness is an emergent product of brain function, as you pull apart the brain function, the consciousness should collapse. Easy. So they're really special pleading themselves already to say, okay, we acknowledge that this dude's brain was barely functional or not functional, and he's having this hyper real experience, conscious experience that still aligns with our model. I'm not sure we should even give him the free pass. And like I say, let's say.
So I was just going to add, and that's also where we need to consider kind of other experiences like terminal lucidity as well that address that argument.
And let's go back to that balloon analogy. Okay, I blow up a bunch of balloons with air. 80% of the times when I release the air, the balloon collapses back to a balloon. But if 20% of the times after releasing all the air, the balloon got bigger, I would realize something's weird's going on, right? I would not say, oh, this is still consistent with my air hypothesis. So, I mean, why do materialists do that special pleading them with NDEs and these other type of experiences?
I suppose they've got the benefit, though, of saying that, well, the brain is incredibly complex and we haven't understood it yet. There must be something else going on in the brain function that we haven't discovered yet or been able to measure.
That's a promissory materialism. I mean, they can do that if they want, but it won't be convincing to anybody but them. But so more sophisticated materialists would say something like this. All right, give me a second. All right. Where is it? So give me 1 second. All right, where is this? In my notes. Hang on. Oh. So it's in my notes. Yes, that is good. All right. Okay, so I do need them. All right. There they are. Okay. So where was I? Okay. So this would probably be the correct. I'm going to present their case and I'm going to pick it apart. They would say something like this now. Many events can trigger NDEs, and that the dying brain creates a fantasy as a coping mechanism. An example they might use would be, studies have shown with rats that, rats that are in a cardiac arrest state right at the end have a brain spike. They would say that possibly that brain spike is similar in humans and causes an NDE. They would also say, as a person is dying, they have a DMT dump. And then they would still say, like I say, brain structure explains the similarities. They have the experience, they assume it was the afterlife, and they embellish it. That'd be more the current model. So now to pick this apart some.
But before you do as well, just add on to the rat study that was Borgegin et al. And they recently, didn't they, in 2023, also had a similar reading with patients who were in coma, who experienced a gamma band burst of electricity.
Yeah. So the first explanation is kind of a catch-all. A lot of things can cause it. And the next thing is, well, why does the brain need a coping mechanism? If anything, it should be fighting to stay alive. But then comes the energy spike thing. Yes, it is an energy spike, but it's relative to a flat line. The spike in energy is not enough energy consistent with conscious experience. It's there, it's a spike, but if you're to look at the level it's at normally, you would not attribute consciousness to that. Then
so it's still so the spike is high relative to a flat line, but compared to normal consciousness, it's still way below the amount of activity you would need.
Yeah. And the next thing is the DMT argument. That is just not true. And the neuroscience.com, you can look Journeys Beyond Contrasting Psychedelic Trips and Near-Death Experiences. There are similarities, and here's what it says from the article. The researchers found shared themes such as ego dissolution and space-time transcendence. However, specific themes like life reviews, meeting with deceased loved ones, and a sense of no returns were only reported in NDEs. So that's a key detail. All right, so again, there's not the life review, meeting deceased loved ones, and a sense of no return type of thing with the DMT experience. So a DMT dump, even if you had that dump, wouldn't produce that. And this is problematic. So for the materialist, this isn't user friendly. So basically, somebody can take a substance noted for causing people to feel out of body, known for producing hallucinations, and known for people sometimes making them feel like they're genuinely dead. They can take that substance and not trigger an NDE experience. So if NDEs are some way hardwired into the brain, don't you think that would kick it in? I mean, that's got to be a mighty clever brain region to take DMT to know that, oh, I'm not genuinely dying or stuff like that, so I shouldn't do the life review, meeting deceased loved ones and stuff like that. You got to admit, that's pretty clever, right? That is exactly what you'd expect if NDEs were an external event, but an internal event? You got to give an awful lot of credit to brain structure on that one, right? That's a mighty clever brain structure to not fall for it. And lastly, there is no known brain structure. And the last skeptical argument is, after the experience, they tend to embellish it. So going back to the NDE stuff, now we're going to go back to each of the categories, the beginning of the NDE. So, the very first stage. All right. So I've already mentioned vertical cases. I'm going to come back to that. So, according to skeptics, the beginning of an NDE is, it's all brain chemistry, but the beginning of the NDE is consciousness leaves the body. Here would be my first question. How would natural selection produce a belief in dualism when materialism is correct? There doesn't seem to be any advantage to this. So why would a confused brain, even under materialism, even think to have consciousness leave the body? You know what I mean? Why would it do that? So the next question would be is, why would a flatline reduced consciousness impaired brain know to put this hallucination in the correct settings when it could put it in any, right? Why put it there? It could trick itself and put it anywhere. Why there? For example, dreams have endless settings. Why not NDEs? And the next thing is, why would a flatline reduced consciousness impaired brain put just the correct people in the scenario? It puts the doctors and their nurses. Why not put Mickey Mouse? There's no reason it shouldn't. And this is, like I said, where we get vertical cases. I'm going to assume your audience knows what they are, so I'm not going to go into much detail. But, skeptics tend to explain vertical cases as, okay, they got the knowledge, but they got it through normal sensory perceptions because they had a little sliver of consciousness left to them, so to speak. But okay, let's say that's true. Okay, they're getting this stimuli. Well, how do they reconstruct it correctly? I mean, they're hearing the stimuli, but their eyes are closed. Surely they could find other explanations in a confused, scrambled, hallucinating brain besides the correct explanation. Why does it get it correct? So all of this first part, now if it's an external event, it explains it easily. If it's an internal event, you get these type of things. Then you get the transition. It's a mighty impressive, hallucinating, confused brain that knows it needs to transition from one place to another, right? That's pretty impressive. Also, I want to note something. That the confused, scrambled brain has the correct senses in stage 1. That's pretty impressive for a confused, scrambled brain to suddenly put somebody at their correct default setting, so to speak, without glasses or lack of hearing, right? That's pretty impressive. Then you got the transition stage. So like I say, why would a flatline reduced consciousness know it needs to add this extra part to the steps, right? Then you're in a spiritual realm. How can you hallucinate something that's more real than real? Now I can understand how you can have a vivid dream. There's just nothing for the hallucination to build on. Somebody reports having superior senses, new colors, stuff like that. And people just take that for granted, but how can a hallucination generate new colors and new sounds?
Yeah, when you have nothing to draw on experientially while you're awake.
Experience. The only way one could have that experience would be, let's say, someone genuinely saw new colors. Maybe if they went to like an exotic paint shop, they could see something like that. But that's an external experience. Or, these superior senses. So, okay, there has to be a region of the brain in the internal view that generates this, right? What's the point of having an internal region of the brain that can generate superior senses to what we have down here that only kicks in when you're about to die? You would think that'd be very useful in other places, right? I mean, that would be pretty useful. What a waste of something that could have helped our ancient ancestors survive in the wild, right? But it only kicks in when you're about to die. Oh, what a waste. I'm going to go into the exception with this, but you just get deceased loved ones. Why not living people as a whole? Why not your friends and roommates? You know what I mean?
And again, as you mentioned earlier, why not cartoon characters or movie characters that you've seen throughout your life?
Yeah, I mean, if it's an internal event, again, this region that we haven't demonstrated exists, having all this stuff dumped on it, is doing a mighty good job, right? Again, we don't even know if it exists. So, and then this region just knows to make it in telepathy? That doesn't work. So again, the external argument easily explains this. So the next thing is a life review. All right. So what is the point of a life review if somebody's future reads extinction? What's the point? And next thing, and this is what is weird for the internal argument. So why does the consciousness then review its actions toward others, oftentimes from the perspective of how they treat that person? Oftentimes these reviews draw upon things that are once forgotten. Why these obscure details? Why no interest in the things that really mattered to the guy, though? And why create a fantasy, if this is the end for the internal thing, that would cause one to reject the very things that provided evolutionary advantages, such as wealth and status, right? Those things help down here. So evolution is going to select a false belief that would that would teach us to reject the things that help us.
Yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive.
So again, it's pointless. But then again, this may seem weird, but so if this is a hallucination, it would seemingly require the hallucinating person to hallucinate a consciousness who then reviews the life of the hallucinating person. That is some mighty weird stuff, right? Interesting. That is pretty impressive for this hypothetical region. I mean, it makes no sense. It's obviously an external experience. Then we got the return. So the consciousness is told it needs to return to the body. Oftentimes the person pleads to stay behind, so it's got to return. So my questions would be for the internal proponents: why does the hallucination know it needs to end the experience? That would imply a hallucination would somehow know the body will survive. How would this hallucination know that?
Especially in a physical state where it often seems much more likely that survival isn't an option.
Yeah. So going on from that, I'm going to keep going. All right. So again, who is this consciousness arguing with? If this is a hallucination, then the hallucination consciousness is arguing with itself about how it will hallucinate. It's then being told by itself it cannot hallucinate in a certain way, but must hallucinate in another way. Why would a hallucinating consciousness so care that it hallucinated in a logical way? How does one aspect of the hallucination know it needs to get the experience right and correct another aspect of the hallucination getting it wrong? That is mighty impressive, right?
Especially to do it consistently among all the NDEs that we've had.
And then, upon the return, as they're returning back, when they get back to the stage where it began, their senses go back from, superior back to their normal setting. That's pretty impressive that, again, this internal region got that little detail correct, right? And if it's hallucinatory fantasy, it's a mighty amount. It's interesting all the things that this internal region just knows to avoid. So we don't find NDEs like this. We don't find NDEs that are political. For example, someone sees Trump voters in hell. We don't find those NDEs. We don't find NDEs that seek profound religious answers, such as the fine points of Catholicism. Why are pets so rarely in NDEs? People love their pets. Why not hallucinate them? Why not utterly weird NDEs, such as going to like a cloud realm or a water realms? You can find that type of stuff in video games all the time. If it's a hallucination fantasy, sky's the limit, so to speak, right? Why not hedonistic NDEs, where somebody's having an orgies? People like that type of stuff. So again, if this is all an external event, that makes perfect sense, The spirit realms just don't deal with that stuff. But in internal, why is the brain so limited? But like I say, the materialist argument ought to predict another thing, though. Screwball NDEs, as I like to say. What's the odds of the brain structure always getting it right? Surely the brain structure should make mistakes, right? So why not generate an NDE where the person makes a tremendous amount of errors in describing what they experienced on Earth? They get their medical setting completely wrong. Then they're sent to some sort of afterlife realms with angels playing harps, and they partied up with a Baywatch crew. Then during the life review, the being of light just gets it totally wrong about you, makes up things you never did right. Brain structures don't always get it right.
And again, that sort of thing often happens in normal dreaming as well.
Yeah. Or, again, other type of screwball things. For example, a life review being done by, say, Elmer Fudd. Elmer Fudd's reviewing your life. But okay, where are those NDEs? Surely brain structure wouldn't get it all right, right?
Not consistently, you would have thought.
Yeah. And then the people who experience these screwball NDEs would know this was nonsense. And surely they would come forward, right? I mean, it's easy enough to make a YouTube video, right?
Or TikTok these days.
Yeah, YouTube, TikTok, right? A post. Oh, give me a break about NDEs. This is what happened to me. They're all saying quiet over this. For what? Fear of offending people? I live in the United States. We're not afraid to offend people, especially religious people. So where are these NDEs? So if an NDE is an external event, all this goes away. Too easy, right? All these weird issues go away, but materialists have to postulate the exact opposite of an experience of an NDE to explain NDEs, and then they truly act puzzled to why they can't explain the near-death experience. In a small amount of cases, sometimes people do report seeing living people during their NDEs. But overwhelmingly, these cases all involve young children, and they report the experience was meant to comfort them. So it's mainly in young children. I mean, who else should they see, right? It has to be that way. So that argument, I can see where they're coming from, but it doesn't demonstrate as much as they wish. The second thing is, sometimes NDEs have a sense of prophecy, and sometimes these prophecies don't come to pass. But that's a misunderstanding of the term prophecy. In the West, we tend to see prophecies as absolutist things, that this must come to pass and stuff like that. But historically, prophecy hasn't had that meaning. In ancient times, a prophecy was things that might come to pass if behaviors don't change, but it's not deterministic. And in the essence of prophecy, this might come to pass. It's not deterministic, so that argument doesn't work.
And are there prophecies on the other end of the scale that do come true a lot?
I'd have to really dig more into that. I mean, that's one thing I have not dug into as much. I know the argument. I'm going to admit I don't study that aspect as much, but from what I've studied about it, like the Howard Storm case or other cases like these things, it tend to indicate these things might happen if things don't change. And, and I enjoy, like I said, history and all that. And that was the ancient mode of prophecy. It wasn't a deterministic thing. For example, in the book of Job, no, not Job, the book of Jonah. And, the book of Jonah, he was sent to Nineveh to preach repentance, preaching all that, and that Nineveh will be judged. Nineveh went into repentance, and all of his prophecies did not come true. He was never considered a false prophet because he told what would happen if they didn't change their behavior. So that's an example of the ancient sense of it. Again, I keep pressing this. The evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of the external argument as opposed to the internal argument. So that's one of the reasons why I accept NDEs are an external glimpse into the afterlife. Now, materialists ought to sit back and think about this last point. They acknowledge NDEs exist. And the data point is overwhelmingly that if somebody has an NDE, they're going to believe it was real, and it's going to be a life-changing thing for them. So according to materialists who want to be rational in all things, there's a type of experience that is hardwired into the human brain that can erase irrationality. Now, logically speaking, this hardwiring should be in all human brains. So how can we ever be rational if our default setting is set to irrational? It's the equivalent to having a ruler with the wrong measurement sizes on it trying to correct itself. It can't. So if materialists want to be rational, it's a dead end for them. Their brain is wired not to be rational, and there's no way to fix it. That should bother them if they think about it. So that would be my point of view on this NDE. So that is my viewpoint as it is.